staying in the NFL here, we're going to talk about the running back resurgence that we've kind of seen in the last year. Obviously, there was a massive kind of backstep in the previous 5 or maybe even 10 where people were starting to talk about how running backs, you might not have to pay them as much. You might just be able to draft a guy and get a good offensive line and just kind of run with that and it'll work. We kind of saw teams like the Chiefs able to win with younger running backs and stuff like that. But this year, things have suddenly changed. Running backs who didn't really get very big contracts and changed teams, thinking like Henry and Saquon and stuff like that, suddenly popping off, having incredible years, and leading their teams on impressive playoff runs like Saquon and like Henry was going on before, obviously, his Ravens were stopped by the Bills. But regardless, I think it's an important conversation to have. I think it's certainly something that, after how big of a conversation it was last offseason, I think
Yeah.
I think it was just it's certainly going to be the big thing people are going to be talking about this off season. At least I believe.
Yeah. Because, I mean, it was, yeah, like you said, the conversation really was why are we paying running backs? Because their success is essentially dictated by the position group in front of them, the offensive line. And because teams would essentially, like, say, if you can swap out these guys, they're kind of replacement, like you can replace them very easily. But this season, more than any season, has shown that that kind of mentality maybe needs to change, because I think there's kind of 5 guys that showed that this year, and these are the 5 guys who are the big kind of free agent additions to their teams this year. Obviously, Saquon Barkley is the big one with the Eagles. We already know what he did. Same with Derrick Henry on the Ravens, but also some of these other guys like Josh Jacobs on the Packers let go by the Raiders. I think a 1,300-yard season. Aaron Jones to the Vikings, over 1,000-yard season. Joe Mixon to the Texans, even with all the injuries, over an 1,000-yard season. All of these guys were let go by their prior teams to say, you know what, maybe we don't need you anymore. And they've shown that like a franchise running back is still a thing. Because we talked about that at other positions for so long, like the franchise quarterback, you need your number 1 wide receiver. But that kind of emphasis that was placed on running backs for a while, especially, like in the 2000s and what have you, that kind of was changing away, but now it's shifting back. And I think kind of a big point of emphasis, even in the games we saw today, as of recording on the divisional weekend, like that I know you watched this game too, Simon, but that Ravens Bills game, as much as it was advertised as the show between quarterbacks and MVP candidates in Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson, both teams were not necessarily led by those guys that entire game. It was because of their running game. Like you saw when the Ravens needed plays and they needed that long drive, it was because Derrick Henry tore off some runs. It's because the Bills had success with Josh Allen as a runner, not a passer necessarily, or James Cook. So we're seeing that in this version of the NFL, this is how you win games now, is through the running game. And it's so interesting because that's such a shift from what it was when you think even 5 years ago with the Chiefs and this pass-happy Tyreek Hill, run him 90 yards down the field. But the NFL is kind of cyclical like that.
Yeah, it's certainly been interesting. I think that I mean, considering the direction it was going in, it really is odd to think that we're right back in the spot that we were maybe 15 years ago, where running backs obviously were valued very highly. And you got to wonder if maybe part of that is the fact that passing stats were starting to go down. Obviously, we saw Rodgers win an MVP with not necessarily the most incredible passing stats in the world, and those years of, I think Mahomes had a 50 touchdown year in there, like that kind of started petering off and all of that. And I think now with that, it's starting to balance out on the other side. Teams are starting to try and use running backs more, and especially in this playoffs, I think you can give a little bit to the fact that we've had a few bad weather games. I think that Ravens-Bills game is a very good example of that. I think they shared the stat of, I think it was Lamar's like coldest game ever.
Coldest game.
Yeah. And I mean, anytime you hear stuff like that, the immediate thought is, yeah, give it to the running back. Because I mean, we saw what happens when you try and pass when it's that cold. When Andrews dropped a ball straight out of his hands, and that lost them the game at the end of the day, right? With that 2-point conversion. But Yeah, I think that I think that it does show that running backs will always be important. I think that while there is still that other side of the argument, you can still run the ball with a good offensive line and a rookie. You can. But is that rookie going to get you 200 yards like Saquon did? Or is he going to be able to tear off insane runs like Henry was all year long for the Ravens? No, that's not going to happen. You will not be able to win a game with that type of running back more often than not. And if you want a guy with the talent level of Saquon or the talent level of Henry or any of the other guys on that list, frankly, with Mixon, Jacobs, all of those guys, like I think what we're seeing is they are worth something. I think that's what this year proved.
Yeah.
I think that the value of running back should go up because of it. And I hope it does, because I think that's been one of those things where a lot of people thought it was a dying position in a way, similar to kind of the, maybe not as bad as the fullback, but it was starting to seem like it. It was starting to seem like that was slowly heading in that direction with how much passing was getting favored. But
yes, and I think the conversation, kind of to your point, again, was this idea of it's not necessarily that it's not an important position and that it's like going to go out of phase, but it's that it's dependent on the success of another position. And to an extent, to kind of play almost devil's advocate a little bit, I do still think that's true. And I'll kind of like to shift the conversation over to another side of it. You also have to look at the fact that a lot of these guys I just listed, while I moved teams, they also moved to better offensive line situations, right? Saquon Barkley would not have had a 2,000-yard year if he stayed with the Giants and played behind that offensive line. Instead, he goes and plays behind one of the best offensive lines in the league in Philadelphia. Same thing with Derrick Henry. That Ravens offensive line has been spectacular. I mean, look at even like a guy like Roger Rosengarten, who wasn't predicted to be that good, whatever he was, third-round pick out of Washington. But yet you see him like manhandling T.J. Watt in the wild card round. These guys had great offensive lines. Again, Josh Jacobs in Green Bay, that's another one. Minnesota and Texans, no, but Minnesota, yes. And then the other kind of side of that is I look at a team like my Seahawks, where I think Kenneth Walker, and maybe I'm a homer, but I think Kenneth Walker has just as much talent as a Saquon Barkley or a Derrick Henry, but his offensive line has been so bad to the point where nobody sees that. And he hasn't gotten the chance to show that. But I think if you put a guy like Kenneth Walker behind an Eagles offensive line, I think there's a chance he rips off a 2,000-yard season, to be quite honest with you. But I think that's where people kind of got it confused is the running backs, they're dependent on the offensive line being good, but that doesn't mean you don't need a good running back. And yes. I think that's maybe where people are getting confused. And I think that's where things will start to change, as people are realizing that in order for your run game to succeed, you do need both. A good running back is still an important part of that conversation.
And I mean, you kind of made my point right there at the end. Exactly what I was going to say after all that was just, I think more than anything is I think while yes, you can survive, absolutely, you can survive with just a good offensive line and a mediocre running back. You'll be fine. We've seen that with the Chiefs. We've seen that with other teams in the past. Like, teams have made it work. But I think what we're seeing here is when you get a good offensive line and you get a incredible running back like Henry, you win. You win. It's as simple as that, right? I think that's what we're seeing. So I think, more than anything, I think we're seeing the value of having both, the value of that. I think before, the conversation was certainly like a good, I think it was almost to the point of like a terrific offensive line with a mediocre running back is just as good as Derrick Henry behind another offensive line. And I think what is being proven this year is no, not at all. You were very wrong. And I think it's a good thing for the position. I think that'll definitely cause the worth to go up. I think it definitely doesn't it doesn't disprove anything, I guess, on the side of, yes, you still need a good offensive line. No shit. That was kind of the funny thing with the way that you started your argument, I think, was just because I do think that in that sense, no, that nothing changed there. You need a good offensive line. You need that for passing. You need that for running. You need that for everything. you can't really win when your quarterback's getting sacked a bazillion times per season. But
Seahawks.
like, yeah, there you go. Well, I mean, that's a fucking perfect example in some of those late Russ years. But like, I mean, yeah, I think more than anything, with how good defensives have gotten, maybe we've gotten to the point where you can't like these elite running backs. Maybe they need a little bit of help to get a little bit more like oomph in their step. But I don't think it hurts you to have a terrific offensive line and a terrific running back. Like, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think that what we're gonna start seeing is, sure, it's gonna cost you a little bit more money to bring in that terrific running back, but it's worth it. It's going to be worth it every single time. If you put that guy behind that line, sure, I guess the argument is injury concerns. I guess that is the one like negative. That's the other side of the coin. But I mean, it works. It absolutely works. I mean, we talked about it in the previous segment with how bad Hurts has been, but there's a reason they're here, and it's not their passing. It's Saquon. Saquon is unstoppable this year. Derrick Henry was in the exact same spot. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I think that it's definitely a good thing for the running back position. I hope they start getting paid more, especially guys like Henry.
Yeah,
absolutely can win you a season.
I agree, and I think just to kind of wrap up this part of it, I think to kind of summarize at least my thoughts on it is, I don't know if this happens, and I'm sure it does happen in management too, because we see them not paying these guys as much. But I think the big thing that people get caught up on is viewing each position group in isolation and not viewing the context around it all, right? Because it's like, well, is Saquon Barkley really this good, and these are his stats or whatever? But there's context behind it, right? And that he was playing behind a bad offensive line. Right? And then that context changes when he moves to Philadelphia. Did Saquon get that much better? He got better, but how much better? Right? There's a context to it, right? Same thing with Derrick Henry moving from Tennessee to Baltimore. Same thing, like, where I'm thinking, like, Kenneth Walker. Like, how great is Kenneth Walker? Well, he's playing behind probably the worst run-blocking offensive line in the league, so he's probably better than people think. Another guy who was kind of, people saw the amount that this team paid for him and we're kind of like, ooh, was Christian McCaffrey. But then again, you move Christian McCaffrey from the Panthers to the Niners and the context changes, and all of a sudden, like, here you go. And so I think that's maybe the caveat behind this, is if you have built that foundation and you've built that offensive line, it is absolutely worth paying for a running back. But you can't maybe necessarily expect to just pay a running back and have that fix all of your issues if you haven't built that foundation first. These things need to complement each other. There needs to be context. It's that with every position group too. Like, if you get a good quarterback but your receivers aren't good, then you end up having Mahomes' season last year, right? If you have a number one receiver but his quarterback's like Mason Rudolph or some shit, then the receiver's not going to have a good year. It's all about context, and people forget that sometimes. So I think that's probably the underlying. If you're the NFL as a league, as a person who pays players, that's the context and the lesson you take out of it, is that I mean, at the end of the day, it's a team sport, and every position is dependent on each other. And so if you're expecting a certain level of success from a certain position group, but you haven't built the foundation or given them the pieces around them to succeed, then you might have to re-examine things and re-examine your expectations.
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to look at it like this as well, Josh Allen is having an incredible year with not a lot of terrific receivers. Obviously, they brought in Cooper later in the year, but no 1,000-yard receiver. I guess by that logic, we should stop paying receivers as much, because all you need is a terrific quarterback, and you can make it to the conference championship. Let's stop paying wide receivers. I mean, it's the same logic as saying that running backs, like, you can make it work with just a good offensive line. Because I think you're absolutely right on your point. I think football is a team sport for a reason. I think we kind of forget about it with the dominance of quarterbacks and how much they are, or how important they are to teams. Obviously, they are still the most important position. Nobody's trying to debate that. But I think you need a well-rounded team to win, and suggesting that having a terrific running back doesn't give you an advantage is just wrong. It's just
Yep.
incorrect. Like even with like, because the funny thing is, like a terrific running back behind a bad O line is still gonna put up good numbers. Like that's the other side of the thing. Like Derrick Henry behind a bad O line is still going to put up good numbers. It's not going to be 2,000 yards, but it's still going to be pretty incredible. And I mean, it was the same with Saquon. You said that he wouldn't have had the same season with the Giants. Correct, he wouldn't have, but he probably would have still had a pretty terrific one with the Giants. There's a reason that he was so good over there for such a long time. Everybody still considered him a top running back in the league. I mean, like, you also can't win a football game with just a good offensive line. That's not really how that works. So I mean, it's
Yeah,
you need a
but it's
balance
more
here.
about it's more about building an identity and having a plan, right? Like that's the biggest thing. And I think your point about the receivers is a good one, right? Like, yeah, like does the success of Buffalo mean you shouldn't pay receivers? Like, I mean, it's a fair point.
Give
Using the
Jamar
logic
Chase
of
only
you shouldn't
$5
pay.
million a year next season.
Yeah, right. Like, does it matter? But it's about how you build your team and set them up for success. If your identity is like what the Bills have done this year, where they're going to focus on the running game and complement the talents of their quarterback in terms of his dual threat ability, to where maybe the passing game is secondary to a run game, then it's fine to not have receivers. Same with Philadelphia, right? But if you're like the Bengals, and I mean, maybe a bad example because of how their defense played, but their offense was well built, and that, like, if you're going to focus on the passing game, then yeah, like you pay your receivers and maybe you don't pay as much to the running back. It's about having a good kind of idea of what you want your team to be, and that needs to be in line with your philosophy, with your talent, with your team building, in order to build a championship caliber roster, because you're never going to be able to fill every single hole. It's just that you need to know who you are. And where teams get themselves in trouble is when they're chasing names and just kind of accumulating players for the sake of doing it and not having an idea of how those pieces fit together. And I think that's sometimes where you put a running back in a certain situation and he doesn't perform, and it's like, oh, why is that? You might have to examine further than that.
Well, yeah, no, for sure. I mean, people were talking about hell. I mean, I think we were talking about Derrick Henry potentially not being that big of a pickup for the Ravens at one point because we all thought he regressed with the Titans. Well, I think the whole Titans team around him regressed. So I mean,
Yeah.
like, and I think we're kind of seeing that this year, right? Where similar thing with I don't think there was a point where people were saying Saquon was regressing. I guess, but like it.
No, but he had injury concerns, and people
Yeah.
were still being like, do you pay to keep him around? Right? It's like there's a reason. Like if it was a clear cut,
I
if it
feel
was
like
as clear cut a decision as it is now, the Giants wouldn't have chosen Daniel Jones over him.
I feel like
Obviously,
I
in
definitely
hindsight,
heard.
and a little bit at the time, it was a stupid decision, but
Yeah. I feel like at least at some point I heard someone say, is Saquon really that much of an upgrade over Swift? Which I think says as much.
that person probably just needs a little bit of like help. That's just not right.
Maybe I feel like I heard that. I don't
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't have sources for that one, to be honest with you, but I feel like I might have heard that. But like I think ideas like that show you exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Right,
Maybe
that's-
upgrade is
that's
the
what
wrong
we've been
word.
talking about
Helps
the
your
whole time.
team. Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's the same thing we've been talking about the whole time.
Oh. I kind of want to pose an interesting question to you, because we've been talking about this in the context of free agency, right? And paying running backs what they're worth in terms of on the free agent market and how much salary you're giving them. But it's a different question entirely when you turn to the draft, because that's another place where running backs have been undervalued.
Yeah.
And unless it's a guy like a Saquon or a Bijan, you haven't seen them go in the first round really even. And so I'll kind of pose this question to you. Let's say you have a guy like Ashton Genty coming into this draft, where he has put up the kind of season he has in college and looks to be a kind of generational running back. Forget team needs, forget all of that. What's the highest pick you would use on a guy like Ashton Genty?
Oh, forgetting team needs makes it a little unfair. That's tough. I don't know.
this isn't supposed to be an exact science,
Yeah, no, that's
but
true.
like that's if your team theoretically needed a running back, like what's the highest you would go?
If your top team need was running back, and you fully believe that he is the missing piece that is going to bring you your Super Bowl, he is the final thing. There's nothing else you can add. I think that I don't think there's really a reason why you can't take him in the top 10. I'd be hard pressed to find one. Like I think yeah, I don't know. I think I if they're talented enough, why not? Like it worked out. I mean, it didn't work out with the Giants, but it worked out in the sense that they got a talented guy, right? Like I mean,
Yep.
and with the Falcons, I think it's been a little slower for Bijan, but I think he's still a very good running back.
Bijan Robinson was the third highest rusher in the league this year, 1,456 yards.
Well, there you go. Clearly not as slow as I thought it was. Yeah, clearly having himself a good year.
Only behind Barkley and Henry.
So there you go. I mean, when you draft a guy high, I mean it works pretty well. I think was Gibbs a first rounder or was he an early second?
Yes,
He
so
was a
that
first rounder.
so that's
the other
what
one.
that was what kind of inspired me to ask that question, was because I remember when that draft happened, it was that same draft as Robinson. People viewed Robinson as a first round pick, to say like Bijan, like yeah, like he's talented enough to be worth that. But Gibbs was the one where people were like, okay, second rounder, and then the Lions picked him in the first round, and social media just kind of went ablaze and said, what a terrible pick. The Lions
Yeah.
don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And now today, right? Like,
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to go back in my head to like other running backs in previous drafts. I think Edwards-Helaire was also an end of the first round.
yes.
If I remember right.
So
That
that's
one,
the thing, right? It can go both ways, because in any draft
yeah.
there are busts. Edwards-Helaire, yeah, depending on how you view him. Najee Harris
Ooh, yeah,
is
that's
another
true.
one.
That's true. I actually forgot about Najee Harris, so I mean there you go.
Yep.
But
Um, to kind of continue on Najee Harris, and this is kind of shifting the conversation a little bit. But so we've talked about these running back contracts that have been handed out. And I think something that's interesting is looking forward to next year and seeing, well, obviously last year was a huge year for running back contracts. Barkley, Henry, Jacobs, all the names we've already listed. I'm going to go through some of the names that are up for next year, and you let me know if you'd pay these guys or not. I'm going to skip Aaron Jones because he's up again. It was a 1-year deal, so that doesn't feel like we won't talk about him because we already kind of touched on that. But again, the first name on that list is Najee Harris. Would you pay a guy like Najee Harris?
ooh, he's a tough one. He's a tough one. I don't have his stats in front of me, which also makes it harder. And I have not watched enough Pittsburgh games to know. Gut feeling, no. Off of like my initial thought, no, I wouldn't. I would not pay him a big contract.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there. He's gotten outshined in his own backfield a lot of the time by Jalen Warren, and I think that is a good comparison to make. Is if it is the same situation and the context is the same, then you can kind of make a judgment.
I think, and Caleb, I don't know if you know. I guess I've never had a conversation with you about F1. I have no idea if you know anything about that sport at all. But the big thing in F1 is how obviously every single team is different. F1 is a series where the development of the car is almost more important than a lot of the drivers. And
Yeah.
so it's often hard to actually tell how good a driver is compared to another one on a different team, right? Because obviously they're both
Right.
using different types of cars. So what a lot of people will do is compare them against their teammates. So the most important thing in an F1 season is usually how well a certain driver did against his teammate. And I think it's very similar. I think you can start to look at it as similar in backfields, where
Yeah.
they're obviously in F1, it's not like you're getting a different amount of laps or some shit than your teammate. You're driving the same amount, right? That's not the same for running backs. Obviously, your starter and your backups are going to get different amount of reps and all that and carries. But yeah, I think it's kind of a similar idea. I think to a certain degree.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good analogy for it. And yeah, so I think that kind of analogy that you use is a reason I wouldn't pay Najee Harris, because
Yeah.
in this sense, he's been driving the same car as a guy like Jalen Warren,
Yeah.
and finishing with a quote unquote slower time, at least in terms of the eye test.
Yeah.
Another guy, if we want to keep going down this list, pay or not pay, this is an interesting one. Like I didn't play this year because of an injury. AJ Dillon, now potentially formerly of the Packers.
Yeah.
Do you pay a guy like AJ Dillon?
No. Probably not. I feel like he's in the same spot as Harris for me, where like off of memory, I don't think he's really proven that much. Yeah, he didn't play this year, so it's obviously the recency part of it isn't quite there. I don't quite remember how he did in that backfield across from Jones. I remember there was at points where obviously he was good enough, but there's a reason he's on this list. But no, I probably wouldn't. I don't think he's proven enough. I'm sure it's not like he's not going to get signed, but I don't think you give him a 5 or however many year contract.
No, I think if I'm a team who needs a running back, he would be a great guy to take a flyer on.
Yep.
But I wouldn't pay him big money. Yeah, I agree. It's just because I think with injuries and having to share the backfield a lot of the time with a guy like Aaron Jones, that's kind of made it tough for him to get his opportunities. But I would be interested to see how he would perform by himself as the kind of leader of a backfield, because I think he's got some talent.
Oh, no, and I definitely don't think that he doesn't. I just think, it's totally a thing of he just hasn't proven it yet.
Yeah. So this is interesting because I mean it's not a very deep running back class, as you see. The first two names I bring up are Najee Harris and AJ Dillon. This last one that I'll pose to you, I think, is the most interesting, and it's Nick Chubb. I think that is a really interesting case. Mm-hmm. Injury is a big part of it because that's been the past 2 seasons has hampered his workload, but before that was one of the better running backs in the league.
One of the better.
With
one of
that
the
risk,
he was on that same category.
Do you pay a guy like Nick Chubb even with the injury concerns?
I'm pulling up his stats here because that's one where I definitely want his numbers in front of me before I say that. Yeah, so in 2024, 8 games played. 2023, 2. And obviously, I believe going back to 2022, I think at that point he was still sharing a backfield with Kareem Hunt. So
potentially, yeah.
Yeah, I think at that point, I mean, last season healthy, 1,500 yards, 5 yards per carry, 12 touchdowns. I mean, you want to talk about elite numbers. That's a pretty elite season right there, right? And I mean, the Browns haven't exactly been the model of anything really in the last few years. So honestly, I think if Chubb does get paid, I think it's going to be 100% because of the season Henry just had, coming off of a bit more of a poor season from him with the Titans. But to be honest with you, off of gut, yes, I think you pay a guy like Nick Chubb. I think Nick Chubb should get a big contract. I obviously injuries. That's the only reason. Injuries is the big thing. I think if he does get a big contract, it needs to be for the exact reason we've been talking about this whole segment, because you have a good O-line, because you already have the rest of the pieces to be able to make him work. He's not going to have to throw himself into the dirt like he probably would have had to constantly with the Browns. But yes, I do think you pay a guy like Nick Chubb.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, on the condition that you get him in for a medical check before you sign that contract.
Well, I think that's how it works.
Yeah, no, I know, but I think you have a couple extra doctors in the room, if you know what I mean, just to really make sure that because when he's healthy, that's a great signing. But it's just that he's had terrible injury luck with a devastating knee injury and then breaking his foot this year. So that's something you have to make sure is on the up and up.
Before the injuries, 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons. The year before, 996. Nearly 5 in a row.
Yeah.
Basically 5 in a row. 1 carry away from 5 in a row. I mean, like, before, obviously, And I mean, he's 29. That's old for running backs.
It's old for a running back.
Yeah, old for a running back, but still, I don't know. He's not ancient. He's not growing gray hairs yet. I think I don't know. It's way too early to give up on him. I think I don't know. I'm kind of with you in the sense of like, yeah, you have to be worried about it. You have to be worried about the injuries. So a little bit of me is like, maybe a 1 year, let him have an elite year and then sign a bigger one, maybe. But yeah, at the same time, he's next year, if he signed a 1 year and was looking for another contract afterwards, he's got the big 3-0 next to his name. That certainly isn't gonna give him any favors.
Yep. No, and that's another thing you have to consider with these guys is age, and that running backs generally kind of wear down faster than other positions do. It's interesting because it's a in all these conversations, they are often separate from a lot of the other positions because it is unique in a lot of it.
It is quite literally your job to run into a dog pile and get hit.
Yeah. So durability is not the same, and that's another big part of the reason people don't pay running backs is because most often coming off of that first contract, it's like you want to get a guy who's a little bit fresher, and doesn't have that wear and tear. Because by the time you hit that second contract, you're
maybe what 26.
You're on the wrong side of 25. Yeah,
26, 27. Like at that point, you're already nearly. Like, they're probably still in their prime for the most part, but, like, you got to be thinking. We're talking about Chubb being out of his prime at 29. If you're, like, that's only a 2-year difference, right? Like, that's the tough thing, right? So, I mean, I don't know. It's tough. Chubb is a really hard. He is probably the hardest person out of all the people you probably named to really decide where to put him. I don't know when McCaffrey's contract is coming up, but he'd almost be close to that with the amount of injuries he's had. So I mean, but that's the same with any player who has injury concerns in any position, really. Like I think a comparable thing, unfortunately, would be Tua. If he signed a big contract not that long ago. If he was coming up on a contract year, do you want to give him a bunch of term?
Well, yeah. No, I mean that's like. The question was, did the Dolphins regret that at this point?
Yeah.
But to kind of shift it back to the running backs and kind of tie in with what we were talking about earlier, I will say I think if we're looking forward to say, wow, expect a big payday from running backs, expect running backs to get paid more because of everything that happened this year. Looking at the free agents this year, you think maybe pump the brakes because the talent maybe isn't there like it was before.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of it took a massive running back free agency class to cause this shift, but it's a little unfortunate that, it's probably not going to happen quite yet. I think maybe we see someone give Chubb a really big deal. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. Like, I think he's absolutely shown the talent, but I also think that it might not be the smartest decision. Like, I don't think if I saw Chubb get one of the biggest like running back contracts ever, like if we saw that happen, like this offseason, I don't know if I'd be thinking good for him. I think I'd be almost thinking, ooh, maybe not the smartest move by that whatever general manager did that. And I think that just tells you enough about the position, right? Where it's like any running back that has injury concerns is going to have an asterisk next to him, no matter how talented. Because, I mean, you almost quite literally can't find a running back more talented than Nick Chubb. I mean, it's probably Derrick Henry, McCaffrey, Saquon, and then I don't know if he's up there with anybody else that you could possibly name, I think. Like, I don't even know. It's certainly going to be interesting to see. I think Nick Chubb's contract is probably going to be the most interesting out of the pool without a doubt.
Yeah, and I would agree. No, it'll be interesting because again, this is we kind of talk about this as a trend throughout. Kind of, you talked about the not paying running backs as a trend over the last like 5 to 10 years. It'll be interesting how this. I don't think this year was a good sample size for it because of everything we've talked about, but how that kind of continues on, and even looking at some of the running backs 2 years from now that'll come up, like Derrick Henry again. Do you pay him at age 32 or whatever he'll be at that time in the contract? Austin Eckler, Travis Etienne, Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, James Cook, Brian Robinson. Lots of interesting names. It'll be interesting to see how this conversation kind of continues to change as football changes and as these dynamics kind of continue to evolve.
Football evolves in crazy ways. I think out of almost any sport I feel like I watch, I kind of take that back. That's all sports, I guess. The more you think about it, is with the different eras, there's always going to be different styles that overtake the game and will just change things. And obviously, different players get paid different amounts because of it. And I think it was unfortunate, kind of what happened in the last 10 years to the running back position. I don't know if I would have predicted, or anybody would have really predicted, this kind of bounce back that we saw this year in kind of the value of a good running back. But now that we are here after this year, it is going to be really interesting to see the future. Like, are we going to be looking back 10 years down the road here saying, wow, that 2024-2025 season was the thing that stopped that heavy passing kind of era and brought us into, once again, a more balanced kind of dynamic offense again. Not to say that hasn't been a thing in the last 10 years, but with running more involved again.
No, it's interesting how the trends shift, and I'm sure it'll shift back, right? Because it's an offensive and defensive balance. Like, when you're passing like you were with the Chiefs in the late 2010s, you have to bring up that safety, right, to play the two deep safety, and then that opens up more space for the running back, right? And then maybe you bring that safety down, and maybe that opens that you start playing more cover one or cover three, and you start trying to throw it deep on the, like it's a give and take. So it'll be interesting to see how it continues to change.
And because of that give and take, let's all just be thankful that we haven't seen Mahomes with an insanely elite running back like Derrick Henry and a good wide receiver at the same time. Because if that happened, I don't even know if I wouldn't tune in.
that Clyde Edwards-Helaire pick was scary. Clyde Edwards-Helaire pick was scary.
Yeah. And he had a good
Didn't
first.
Work out that.
Yeah, I remember that year too. He had a good, really strong first week. I think he had 2 touchdowns in his debut, and that was very much the conversation of, well, fuck, good season, y'all.
Yep. No, I was always rooting for him. He seemed like a good guy. It's too bad it didn't work out, but on the Chiefs hater side,
yes,
it's probably a good thing.
There's two sides. There's 2 sides to that one for sure.
Yeah.